flight crew ignored black woman complaints. She sent in a civil rights audit team. Next day, Renee Moore had never felt so powerless in her life. As a seasoned traveler who took pride in supporting the airline industry through frequent flights, she believed she had seen it all: unexpected delays, cramped seats, occasional baggage mix-ups. But nothing could have prepared her for the day her pleas were not just brushed aside, but willfully ignored by the very flight crew hired to ensure everyone's comfort and safety. In one dreadful moment, Renee's faith in human decency wavered, and with it came a fiery resolve. What she experienced high above the clouds would spark an audacious mission she never saw coming, and neither did they. Renee Moore was a 34-year-old marketing executive originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Growing up, she had learned the art of resilience from her mother, a school teacher who fought for better educational opportunities in their underfunded district. Watching her mother stand up for herself and for others time and time again, Renee grew into the kind of woman who knew her rights and refused to let anyone stomp on them. On a brisk autumn morning, Renee arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport for her flight to Chicago on Delta Airlines. She was no stranger to Delta. She had attained silver medallion status due to the sheer frequency of her trips between Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond. Whether heading to a marketing conference, sealing an ad campaign deal, or visiting distant relatives, Renee's life was practically stitched together by the hustle and bustle of airplanes and airports. Her routine was always the same: arrive 2 hours early, check her bags if necessary, breeze through TSA pre-check, then settle into a lounge if time allowed. That day, however, she felt an inexplicable heaviness. Maybe it was the thick, grey clouds crowding the sky, or the tension in the terminal, or the fact that she was traveling for a difficult meeting. Renee was slated to negotiate a contentious contract with a major client in Chicago. She had spent the week burying herself in legal documents and sales projections, but nothing indicated the real tension that was about to unfold. After a quick cappuccino in the terminal, Renee proceeded to gate A29. Several passengers hovered around the gate agent, anxiously checking on flight times. The weather forecast showed storms moving across the Midwest, so Renee was already bracing herself for a possible delay. Luckily, her flight remained scheduled for an on-time departure. She smiled politely at the gate agent, who handed back her boarding pass without more than a cursory glance. Renee wheeled her carry-on down the jet bridge, feeling a sense of relief that she was closer to takeoff, but that relief was about to be short-lived. Renee found her seat in the Economy Plus section, an aisle seat close to the front. She settled in and tried to push away the looming stress of the negotiations that awaited her in Chicago. She told herself this was just another day, another flight, but the vibe inside the plane felt off. The flight attendant seemed rushed, tight-lipped, and gave off a chilly sort of energy. Renee had flown enough times to sense when the crew was under some kind of pressure, maybe a short turnaround time, or maybe something else. As the plane filled up, Renee noticed a slight commotion behind her. A mother was trying to get her young child situated, while the flight attendant kept insisting the mother check her stroller at the gate. The mother didn't speak much English, and Renee observed that the flight attendant's tone was borderline harsh. The tension was enough to make Renee feel uncomfortable, but she told herself it wasn't her place to intervene. Still, the difference in how some passengers were being treated nagged at her mind. Within minutes, another passenger, an older gentleman, politely requested an extra blanket. The flight attendant responded that blankets were for first-class passengers only and made no move to accommodate him. Renee noticed that not all flight attendants adhered strictly to that rule, but this particular one seemed determined to demonstrate a sense of unwavering authority. As Renee settled into her seat, the overhead bins started to overflow. Another flight attendant swept through, telling passengers to hurry up because they didn't have all day. When the plane was finally ready to push back from the gate, Renee exhaled, hoping once they were in the air, the tension would fade. Once airborne, Renee removed her laptop to do a little last-minute prep for her meeting in Chicago. She had a near-fanatical respect for deadlines and wanted to ensure everything was in place. About 30 minutes into the flight, however, the plane encountered mild turbulence. The seatbelt sign flickered on. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll need to stow your laptop," said the flight attendant, approaching Renee's row. Renee nodded, snapping the device shut. She politely asked if she could finish saving her document. The flight attendant seemed annoyed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Ma'am, you need to comply immediately." The attendant snapped. Renee, taken aback by the abrupt harshness, complied. She put her laptop into the seatback pocket momentarily, and the attendant stormed off. Renee blinked. That small exchange was the first of many times during the flight that she felt singled out. She glanced around. Others were also putting away their laptops, but the flight attendant hadn't spoken to them nearly as tersely. Renee tried to shake it off. Maybe that flight attendant was having a bad day. After the turbulence subsided, Renee felt a strange chill in the cabin. She pressed the call button to ask if the cabin temperature might be raised slightly. A male flight attendant came over, mask-like expression on his face. "How can I help you?" he asked, voice low and dispassionate. "It's quite cold in here," Renee said. "Could you see if the temperature can be adjusted? Or maybe I could get a blanket." His eyes flicked quickly over Renee. "Blankets are for purchase if you're not in first class. It's policy." Renee tried to keep her cool. She'd flown Delta enough times to know that, on many flights, if you asked politely, flight attendants often offered you a blanket if they had spares, especially in Economy Plus. But Renee wasn't about to argue. She asked if she might purchase one, only to be told they'd run out of the supply. "Then is there any way to adjust the temperature, or even get a hot beverage?" "We have coffee," he replied curtly, "but we're not doing service again for another hour." He didn't wait for Renee's response. He walked away, leaving Renee with an uneasy sense of having been dismissed. Maybe it was no big deal, Renee told herself. Perhaps they were short-staffed today and anxious about the turbulence. Still, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. As Renee glanced around, she saw another passenger white, seated in the same section, ask for a blanket. The flight attendant's response was more polite, though the answer was that they had no more to give out. The difference in tone, though subtle, was evident. Renee had just about managed to push aside her earlier frustrations, being denied a blanket, told to stow her laptop abruptly, and ignored by the crew when a sudden jolt came from behind. Her seat pitched forward slightly, causing her elbows to bump the armrests. She paused, thinking maybe it was just a one-time thing. But then it happened again, and again with a dull, repetitive thud. Each kick rattled her seat frame, making it nearly impossible for her to settle into reading or catch a moment's peace. At first, she tried to give the passenger behind her the benefit of the doubt. After all, airplanes were cramped. Maybe he was just adjusting his bag or stretching his legs. But the jolts persisted. She glanced around the cabin, hoping a flight attendant might be nearby to intervene. Instead, she saw only rushed movements, flight attendants hustling between rows, handing off drinks or snapping at passengers to stay seated. No one paid her any attention. Renee pressed the call button, her heart pounding not just from irritation, but from the sense that she was steadily becoming invisible to the crew. She sat, waiting for someone to approach, but the minutes dragged on. She kept the button illuminated, telling herself that surely someone would respond soon. She tried to focus on slow, measured breaths, counting backward from 10 to stay calm. Yet the bumping from behind continued, each thud a reminder that her comfort and apparently her concerns didn't matter enough to be addressed quickly. Finally, the male flight attendant she had encountered earlier stalked up the aisle. Renee noticed how he made a point of letting out a sigh before stopping at her row, his arms folded tightly across his chest. She looked up into his narrowed eyes, trying to maintain a polite demeanor. "What do you need now?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience. Renee lifted her chin, trying to sound as composed as possible. "Excuse me," she began softly. "The passenger behind me keeps kicking my seat. I'm sure it's not intentional, but it's been going on for a while, and I was hoping someone could ask him to stop." She saw the flight attendant roll his eyes, a dramatic, almost theatrical gesture that made her cheeks burn with indignation. "It's a full flight, ma'am," he said flatly, "and there's not much I can do. He's entitled to move in his seat." Renee felt her pulse quicken. "I understand that, but it's continuous, and it's making me really uncomfortable." "Then maybe you should ask him to stop yourself," he cut in, a hint of derision in his voice. "We're in the middle of cabin service. We can't be playing referee for every small annoyance." Before Renee could muster a response, he turned sharply and walked off. His abrupt departure felt more like a reprimand than an attempt to help. Shocked, she stared at the empty aisle spot where he had stood, her mind reeling with embarrassment and anger. She couldn't recall the last time anyone in customer service had dismissed her so blatantly. His behavior felt like a firm statement that her concerns, and by extension, she didn't merit even basic courtesy. The passenger beside Renee, a middle-aged woman, reading a magazine, shifted uneasily, clearly having overheard the exchange. Renee momentarily caught her eye, but the woman quickly looked away, as if reluctant to get involved. Renee swallowed, reminding herself that she was capable of handling this, that her voice mattered. But a ripple of hurt coursed through her, accompanied by a prickling sense of injustice. Steadying herself, Renee unfastened her seatbelt and turned to address the passenger behind her. He was an older man, wearing large over-ear headphones and rummaging through a backpack on the floor. His knee still nudged her seat from time to time, though less aggressively now. Renee leaned over the seatback, careful to keep her voice calm and friendly. "Hi, sir," she said. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think your knee might be hitting my seat. I know it's tight quarters, but could you please keep a bit of space? I'd really appreciate it." He looked up with apologetic eyes, removing his headphones. He seemed genuinely surprised. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said. "I didn't even realize. I'll keep my legs over this way." He tucked his legs closer, adjusting the angle of his body. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Renee exhaled, relieved. "It's all good. Thank you so much." As she turned back around, Renee felt a weight lift. At least the kicking had stopped. But the flight attendant's reaction lingered in her thoughts like a bitter aftertaste. She wondered if she was overreacting. Maybe she just had bad luck with this particular crew. However, the dismissive attitude, the rolled eyes, and the overall sense of being disregarded made it impossible for her to find any solace. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she had looked different, or if she had been a passenger with higher status, her complaint might have been handled with more respect. Each time Renee replayed the conversation in her head, her frustration grew. She wasn't just upset about her seat being kicked. She was disturbed by how the flight attendant had effectively told her to figure it out alone, as if she were a child interrupting an adult's important work. What about passengers who are anxious or afraid to confront strangers, or those who are not fluent in English? Would they receive the same indifference? Renee leaned back, eyes drifting over the rest of the cabin. Other passengers were adjusting air vents, requesting drinks, and one passenger even asked a flight attendant for a headset. Those requests seemed to be met more politely, maybe not with overflowing warmth, but certainly without the overt rudeness Renee had faced. Did they view her as an annoyance, or worse, as someone who wasn't worth the time and effort? The silent question gnawed at her. Though the immediate crisis had been resolved, Chapter 5 of Renee's journey ended with a sour note, a realization that the very people tasked with ensuring her safety and comfort seemed unwilling to do so. It wasn't just the repeated kicks to her seat that stung, but the sting of being blatantly disregarded in a place where she expected at least minimal courtesy. That sting would not fade anytime soon, and it would eventually ignite a fire in Renee's heart that the airline would come to regret. Not long after, the mother Renee had seen earlier was struggling to calm her crying child. Another flight attendant walked up the aisle, clearly irritated. Renee overheard the attendant telling the woman in a curt tone that she needed to make her son quiet down. The mother looked mortified, frantically trying to soothe the toddler. Renee noticed again that the attendant barely tried to be accommodating or comforting, even though such situations are common on flights. Renee, unable to stay silent, caught the mother's eye. "Do you need any help?" Renee asked gently. "Sometimes a lollipop can distract them, if you have one." The woman, grateful, nodded. She spoke haltingly in English. "Thank you. I have candy, but he is scared of the turbulence." Renee empathized, recalling a time she had flown as a child and felt terrified during rough flights. The flight attendant huffed, as though Renee's simple act of kindness was an inconvenience to them. She turned on her heel without offering assistance. As Renee dug into her own carry-on bag, hoping to find anything that might help distract the child, maybe a small toy or an extra snack, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She looked up to see an older black woman across the aisle, leaning in. "I saw how they treated you," the woman whispered. "That was not okay. You did nothing wrong, and they keep talking to you like that." Renee sighed. "I've never had this happen before on Delta. It's bizarre." The woman shook her head. "Well, you know how it goes. Sometimes they show their true colors, and we see them the most." Renee's frustration collided with her sense of justice. She thought about letting it slide after all. It was just a few rude remarks, right? But the more she reflected, the more she felt it was part of a pattern. She saw it in the way the attendants interacted with other non-white passengers, the dismissiveness, the condescending tone, the refusal to help with legitimate concerns. Renee began to wonder if she should speak to the head flight attendant or at least file a complaint after landing. Halfway through the flight, the turbulence had eased and beverage service resumed. When the cart reached Renee's row, she asked for a cup of tea, hoping a warm drink might calm her nerves. The flight attendant, the same male attendant, poured coffee for the passenger in the window seat, then turned to Renee. "What do you want?" he asked, voice clipped. "May I have tea, please?" Renee responded politely. He glared at her. "We're out of hot water right now. I only have coffee left in this pot." Renee was puzzled. She could see the steam rising from a kettle on the cart. "It looks like there's a kettle right there. Is that for hot water?" He narrowed his eyes. "This is for passengers who requested it earlier. You didn't." Renee's temper flared. "Earlier? You told me service wouldn't resume for another hour, so I couldn't request it. Can you please pour some from that kettle?" By now, the tension was plain enough that people nearby were watching. The attendant glared, as if Renee's request was an enormous imposition. Eventually, he poured her a cup, almost sloshing the scalding water over the rim, and dropped in a tea bag. He handed it over without a word, then moved on. Renee felt humiliated. Even simple requests were met with hostility. A couple seated behind Renee whispered among themselves, shooting Renee sympathetic looks. Clearly, they had noticed this pattern too. Renee inhaled slowly, trying to keep her composure. The flight seemed never-ending. Renee read through her notes for the upcoming meeting, but her mind kept drifting to the flight crew's behavior. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, Renee was bristling with anger. Normally, she would have tried to speak privately with the flight attendants or perhaps fill out a formal complaint card, but a part of her suspected it would be ignored. As the wheels touched down at O'Hare International Airport, Renee felt dread rather than relief. The final straw came when the plane pulled up to the gate. Passengers were gathering their belongings, and Renee noticed the overhead bin above her seat was stuck. She tried to gently jiggle the latch. Nothing. So she waved over the nearest flight attendant, a petite woman with a forced smile. "Excuse me, the bin is stuck. Can you help me open it?" Renee asked. The attendant looked annoyed, but at least she walked over. She gave the latch one stiff yank, then declared, "It's jammed. We'll have to wait until maintenance comes." Renee stared. "But my bag is in there. I have a meeting soon." The attendant shrugged. "I can't do anything about that. You'll just have to sit and wait." Passengers behind Renee were starting to grumble. They couldn't get by to exit. The flight attendant shot Renee a look, as though this was all her fault, then made an announcement for everyone to remain seated until maintenance could arrive and unjam the bin. People began shifting uncomfortably, complaining about missed connections and delayed schedules. Renee tried to offer help or see if the latch could be manipulated from another angle, but the flight attendant barked at her to stay seated. "Don't touch it," she said. "You could break it more." Feeling singled out yet again, Renee sank back into her seat, her heart pounding with frustration. Finally, a gate agent and a maintenance worker came on board. The latch was freed within seconds, and Renee retrieved her bag. As she walked down the aisle, she heard the flight attendant mutter under her breath, "Some people just like to complain about everything." That was enough. Renee's face burned, but she refused to engage. She was determined to channel her anger in a more impactful way. While she walked through the jet bridge, she resolved that she would not let this go. After finally escaping the chaos of that flight, Renee's next few days in Chicago were consumed by back-to-back meetings. She had business deals to finalize, and the intensity of negotiations left her exhausted by evening. Yet, even in her busiest moments, her thoughts kept returning to what had happened on the plane. The simmering anger she felt for the flight crew's dismissive attitude and outright hostility didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger with each replay in her mind. One evening, after a long day of contractual debates, Renee checked into her hotel room, threw her blazer on the bed, and stared at herself in the mirror. She saw someone who was tired, but still standing tall. Memories from her childhood filled her mind, her mother writing letters to local officials about poor school conditions, rallying other parents to show up at board meetings, refusing to let injustice slide. Renee realized that the determination she'd witnessed as a girl wasn't just her mother's trait, it had shaped Renee too. She thought about all the women she knew, friends, co-workers, neighbors, who had complained of subtle discrimination, microaggressions, or outright racism when traveling. It's an unfortunate reality, some would say, shrugging it off as part of life. But Renee no longer wanted to merely shrug it off. How many times had she accepted subpar treatment at hotels, restaurants, or on planes, telling herself that maybe the person was just having a bad day? It dawned on her that, all too often, society taught marginalized groups to dismiss these moments as minor inconveniences rather than the deep injustices they were. Fired up, Renee pulled out her laptop and began typing a detailed letter. She documented every second of the incident from the moment she boarded to the instant she left the aircraft. She described the flight attendants' dismissive behavior, their refusal to address basic concerns, the difference in treatment she observed toward other passengers, and how she was left feeling invisible and powerless in a setting where safety and service should have been paramount. Her emotions surged onto the page. Anger and hurt intermingled, but so did a sense of steadfast purpose. She wrote, rewrote, and edited until the words captured not just her frustration, but a call for real accountability. It wasn't just about Renee Moore's personal grievance. It was about shedding light on an entire system that enabled these attitudes to persist unchecked. Taking a short break, she scrolled through her phone for her friend Alicia's number. Alicia was a seasoned civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., and Renee trusted her judgment. When the phone rang and Alicia picked up, Renee's voice wavered between rage and determination as she recounted everything. She admitted she felt violated and humiliated. Alicia listened intently, expressing outrage, but also a strategic calm. "You know," Alicia said softly, "you have every right to file a complaint, Renee. You also have the power to demand something bigger, real, systemic scrutiny. It's not just you. This happens to countless others who might never speak up." That conversation planted a seed in Renee's mind, the possibility of a civil rights audit. The more she and Alicia discussed it, the more sense it made. If an airline was systematically failing certain groups of passengers, they needed to be investigated from top to bottom: hiring practices, training programs, complaint resolution processes. The scope of such an audit could shine a light into every nook and cranny of the company's culture. Later that night, Renee left Alicia a voicemail. "I've decided. I'm not just filing a complaint. I'm going to push for a civil rights audit. I want to make sure no one else goes through this." The next day, Renee's conviction crystallized during her final negotiation meeting with the Chicago client. Even as she maneuvered through contract terms and marketing strategies, she felt an undercurrent of confidence she hadn't noticed before. For the first time, Renee saw parallels between her corporate negotiations and her looming battle against the airline. In both arenas, victory depended on documentation, clarity, and unwavering resolve. When she stepped out of the boardroom, triumphant with a sealed deal, she immediately dialed Alicia again. This time her voice rang with certainty. "I'm all in. I want your guidance in drafting a formal request for an external audit. Let's loop in anyone who can help: activists, legal experts, community leaders." By the time she returned to her hotel that evening, Renee had already set up a conference call with Alicia, a local NAACP representative and a public relations consultant she knew from her marketing circles. During that call, she laid out her experience in painstaking detail, answering every question they posed. The PR consultant pointed out that stories like Renee's often fade from public attention unless they're championed by a clear, bold demand. A civil rights audit, Renee realized, was exactly that demand: a lever powerful enough to force a giant corporation to confront its flaws. As Renee hung up, she felt exhilarated, the same way she did after a successful business pitch. But this time, the stakes were bigger than a marketing contract. She was fighting for respect and equality in an industry she had spent years supporting as a customer. The swirl of emotions: empowerment, defiance, even a flicker of fear surged within her. She accepted them all, knowing that real change never comes without a dose of discomfort. That night she hardly slept. Her mind buzzed with possibilities and what-ifs. What if Delta refused her demands? What if they tried to silence her or bury the story? And what if, despite all her efforts, nothing changed? Each doubt threatened to cloud her conviction, yet each time she reminded herself of every humiliating second on that flight. She thought about future travelers: Black women, mothers, anyone who might be scared or unsure of how to defend themselves. Her personal ordeal needed to spark something bigger, something that would leave the airline with no choice but to acknowledge the voices they had ignored. By dawn, Renee was drafting another letter, a formal notice to Delta's corporate offices, detailing not just her complaint, but her insistence on an independent civil rights audit. She had no illusions it would be easy. Corporations, especially those as large as Delta, rarely bend without a public push. Yet Renee felt an unwavering conviction that she was done letting the powerful off the hook. In these sparks of resolve, Renee's campaign was truly born. No longer just a disgruntled passenger, she was ready to become a fierce advocate, determined to hold the airline accountable for every dismissive word and condescending look. She would take this fight as far as it needed to go into corporate boardrooms, legal battlegrounds, or even the court of public opinion. The next chapter of her story would be one of courage, collaboration, and, ultimately, transformation. Despite her exhaustion and emotional turmoil, Renee had to focus on the negotiation meeting that brought her to Chicago in the first place. She spent the next day locked in a boardroom, arguing terms and conditions with the major client. By the end of the marathon session, Renee and her team walked away victorious. She had secured a deal that would elevate her company's market presence for years to come. Under normal circumstances, she would have celebrated. But her mind was pinned on the humiliation she endured on the flight. Her phone pinged with an email as she exited the conference room. It was from Delta's customer relations. They expressed regret for her experience, stating they took claims of discrimination seriously and asked her to provide more details in an online form. Renee's blood boiled at the generic nature of the message. She had provided them with details already. The tone of the email felt perfunctory, as if they were going through the motions. She forwarded the email to Alicia. "This is the kind of lukewarm response they give us when we make noise. We have to turn up the volume," Renee wrote. Alicia replied within minutes, "I've got your back." 2 days later, Renee returned to Atlanta. As soon as she landed, she arranged a meeting with her friends in the civil rights sphere, including Alicia and a small group of legal and public relations experts. She laid out her vision, not just to file a complaint, but to demand a civil rights audit of Delta's practices. A civil rights audit is a thorough investigation into how a company's policies, culture, and employee behaviors affect historically marginalized groups. Typically, major corporations only do them under public pressure or after a lawsuit. Renee believed that if Delta had nothing to hide, they would have no reason to resist. But if they were systematically ignoring complaints from black women and other minority passengers, Renee's request would shine a spotlight on every crack in their system. Her group of allies began drafting letters and press releases. They contacted news outlets, some local, some national, hinting that an important story about airline discrimination was about to break. Renee knew the power of public attention. No large corporation likes to be dragged into the spotlight over allegations of racism or discrimination. Within a week, Renee's complaint had transformed into a broad-based demand. The NAACP got wind of it. Some local activists in Atlanta started tweeting about Renee's situation, calling for Delta to address her grievances. Suddenly, Renee was fielding interview requests from journalists who wanted details of her experience. Delta Airlines responded swiftly, but not in the way Renee had hoped. Their legal department sent Renee a letter that read like a veiled threat, warning that her claims of discrimination could be considered defamatory if proven untrue. They offered her a $200 flight voucher as a gesture of goodwill and an apology for the inconvenience. Inconvenience! Renee fumed. She felt her frustration rise to a new level. This was not about a free flight or a simple apology. It was about ending a pattern of discriminatory behavior. It was about making sure no other black woman or any person of color had to endure the demeaning attitude she had faced. She forwarded the letter to Alicia. "This is exactly why we push harder," Alicia said. "They're trying to make this go away cheaply." Renee had already begun scheduling a strategy meeting with the team she called her civil rights audit crew, a mix of lawyers, consultants, and community advocates. She wanted them to approach Delta's corporate headquarters and demand a formal audit of their hiring, training, and customer service practices. As Renee's story began to gain traction, a local news station in Atlanta aired a segment about her flight experience. They interviewed 2 other passengers from that same flight, both of whom corroborated Renee's account of the rude and dismissive behavior directed toward her. Suddenly, Renee wasn't alone. Her version of events was validated publicly. On social media, people shared their own encounters with flight crews who had dismissed or ignored their concerns, especially if they were minorities. A Twitter thread began trending, titled #Airline Accountability. More and more people chimed in with stories of feeling discriminated against or overlooked, especially by certain flight attendants. Delta tried to stem the tide. They released a statement that they were reviewing the incident and that Delta does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The statement ended with, "We encourage Ms. Moore to continue to cooperate with our internal investigation to reach a resolution." Renee scoffed at the notion that they were now putting the onus on her. She wasn't seeking a hush-hush resolution. She wanted systemic change. At Renee's request, the Civil Rights Audit team composed a formal letter to Delta's CEO, referencing Renee's experience and the subsequent outpouring of similar stories. The letter demanded that Delta hire an independent third party to audit its practices regarding employees' handling of passenger concerns, especially those from marginalized communities. They also asked for transparency, a report on how complaints of discrimination had been handled in the past, along with data about training flight attendants received to handle racial bias. The letter gave Delta a deadline, 14 days to respond publicly with a plan to implement the audit or face a larger campaign to push for federal scrutiny. The group even threatened to bring their evidence to the Department of Transportation, citing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the grounds of race, color, or national origin in programs receiving federal funding. Airlines have certain federal privileges and obligations. Meanwhile, Renee did a round of interviews for radio stations and podcasts. She never sounded hateful or vengeful. She merely demanded basic respect and fairness. Her calm, articulate manner won her the admiration of many listeners. They saw a professional black woman fighting for dignity, and they rallied behind her. About a week later, Renee received an anonymous email from someone claiming to be a Delta flight attendant. The sender stated they had witnessed managers instructing flight attendants to keep interactions with certain demographics quick and minimal if they seemed high maintenance. Renee was stunned at the phrasing. The email alleged that flight crews were sometimes told to avoid engagements that could lead to conflict, implying that certain passengers, often those from minority backgrounds, were more likely to cause trouble. Renee forwarded the email to Alicia. It was only an unverified tip, but if they could find more evidence of such internal policies or unwritten rules, they had a bombshell on their hands. A couple days later, Renee found a second message from a different insider describing how they felt pressured by senior crew members to speed through service in predominantly black or ethnic neighborhoods on certain routes. "We're supposed to be neutrally polite, but not go the extra mile," the email read, especially if the passengers asked too many questions or seemed demanding. "We're told to let them handle their own issues whenever possible." This new information sent shockwaves through Renee. If these accounts were true, it pointed to a systemic pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond her single flight. She and Alicia contacted the whistleblowers, trying to confirm the credibility of their statements. One of them agreed to speak with Renee by phone, provided Renee kept their identity hidden. The phone call lasted 20 minutes, and when it ended, Renee was left breathless by the allegations of racism and classism that the flight attendant claimed was ingrained in certain corners of the company culture. Word got around that employees were leaking information. Delta's internal communications threatened disciplinary action against anyone who shared confidential company policies or documents. Renee heard from one whistleblower that management was scrambling to identify the sources of the leaks. Flight attendants were being reminded that any official statements had to come from corporate PR. Renee's phone rang constantly with queries from reporters, civil rights groups, and potential whistleblowers. The story grew beyond Renee's personal encounter. Now it was about possible institutional discrimination at a major airline. In an attempt to quell the rising tide, Delta sent Renee a new message. They wanted to settle with her directly, offering compensation for her flight and a promise to review training protocols. Renee was not swayed. She politely refused, stating that she would not consider the matter resolved until the civil rights audit took place and the results were made public. This bold stance enraged some top executives. Renee's social media began to fill with negative comments from accounts that looked suspiciously like bots or trolls. She received hateful messages, some even racist in tone, accusing her of trying to get rich off a false accusation. Renee felt a swirl of emotions: fear, anger, frustration, but she refused to back down. Just when Renee felt her spirit wavering, an unexpected figure stepped forward to support her, a high-ranking official in the Department of Transportation. This official, who happened to be a black woman as well, invited Renee to Washington, D.C. for a meeting to discuss her case and the broader implications for federal oversight of airlines. Renee flew to D.C. con another carrier, refusing to set foot on Delta until the matter was addressed. The official met her in a private conference room, listened to her story, and reviewed the whistleblower emails. She indicated that the DOT was paying attention. If Renee's claims of systemic discrimination were validated, the DOT could open a formal inquiry, possibly imposing fines or requiring mandatory changes in Delta's policies. Encouraged, Renee felt her conviction strengthen. This wasn't just about a single, humiliating flight anymore. It was about equal treatment and civil rights in the skies. Weeks passed. Delta continued to stonewall Renee's demand for a civil rights audit. The media attention waxed and waned as new stories came and went. Some of Renee's critics tried to paint her as a troublemaker. A few conservative commentators even argued Renee was pulling the race card. However, Renee's supporters remained steadfast community leaders, advocacy groups, and everyday citizens who had faced rude or dismissive treatment from airline crews themselves. Renee traveled to several speaking engagements, retelling her experience and emphasizing the need for accountability. Each time, she carefully cited factual details, never exaggerating, never indulging in cheap theatrics. She wanted the truth alone to be her sword and shield. Still, progress was slow. Corporate giants rarely move quickly without overwhelming pressure. Renee's contact at the Department of Transportation hinted that they could only do so much without a flood of formal complaints from other passengers. Renee and her team urged anyone who had similar experiences to file official complaints with the DOT. As more complaints poured in, Renee hoped the scale of the problem would become undeniable. Then came the twist no one anticipated. One of the anonymous whistleblowers decided to step forward publicly. Her name was Lori Henderson, and she had been a flight attendant for Delta for over 15 years. She was also white. Lori's father had been active in the civil rights movement decades ago, and she said she could no longer bear to see the hypocrisy of the airline's surface-level statements on diversity contrasted with the behind-the-scenes culture. Lori Henderson held a press conference with Renee and Alicia by her side. Her voice trembled as she revealed how certain managers covertly encouraged flight attendants to be efficient, a euphemism for minimal engagement with passengers they deemed high maintenance, often minority passengers. She claimed that Renee's experience was not unique, but an example of the subtle, systemic issues plaguing certain flight crews. Lori provided documents that, while not explicitly instructing discrimination, hinted at the prioritization of premium passengers and low-maintenance flyers in ways that correlated suspiciously with race and class. This press conference went viral. News networks, including CNN, picked up the story, Delta suddenly found itself under immense pressure to respond directly to the whistleblower's allegations. The outcry grew to a roar, with calls for an independent civil rights audit now echoing throughout social media and from multiple civil rights organizations. The threat of a formal investigation loomed larger than ever. When Delta's stock took a noticeable dip amid the swirling controversy, the company's board of directors demanded a closed-door emergency session. The CEO, the head of PR, and legal counsel faced a barrage of questions about how they had handled Renee's situation. Had they really tried to sweep it under the rug? Why had they not cooperated from the start and avoided a media firestorm? The drama reached its crescendo when a major class action lawsuit was filed. A coalition of passengers, led by Renee Moore, alleged widespread discriminatory treatment by Delta staff. Laurie Henderson and another whistleblower offered to testify, pointing to a pattern in staffing memos and training materials that indirectly encouraged flight attendants to handle concerns from black passengers less thoroughly. Fearing the reputational damage and potential regulatory crackdowns, Delta's leadership made a dramatic pivot. They announced they would voluntarily undergo a comprehensive civil rights audit. They publicly apologized to Renee and the passengers who had experienced discriminatory behavior. They also placed several employees and mid-level managers on administrative leave pending an internal review. The flight attendants who had harassed Renee were suspended, and an internal email was circulated to all Delta employees, clarifying that any discriminatory conduct or dismissive treatment based on race or any other protected characteristic would lead to swift disciplinary action, including termination. Renee watched all this unfold with a mix of relief and triumph. She had never wanted to bring down an entire company. She had only wanted an apology and a genuine commitment to better treatment. Now she stood at the forefront of a major shift in how airlines might handle passenger complaints, especially those involving racism or bias. The civil rights audit commenced under the guidance of a prestigious independent law firm and an expert panel of sociologists and human rights advocates. Over the next several months, they pored over Delta's hiring records, onboard training procedures, complaint logs, and thousands of employee testimonies. The final report confirmed that while Delta had policies in place discouraging discrimination, there was a consistent failure to enforce these policies among certain crew members. The audit made sweeping recommendations, including revamping racial sensitivity training, establishing clearer guidelines for passenger interactions, and adopting a zero-tolerance approach to racially charged complaints. On a personal level, Renee found herself in high demand as a speaker at conferences about corporate accountability and civil rights. She became a shining example of how one person's perseverance can expose and change systemic problems. She also found a renewed sense of self-realizing she had the courage not only to speak truth to power, but also to endure the backlash and keep going. Hard karma arrived for the flight attendants who had shown such flagrant disrespect to Renee. The male flight attendant who barked orders and rolled his eyes at her was fired for violating the company's code of conduct. He later gave a tearful interview to a local newspaper, insisting he wasn't a racist but had been under pressure from superiors. Public sympathy was limited. Many felt he should have known better than to mistreat passengers in such a blatant manner. As for the flight attendant who had blamed Renee for the overhead bin issue, she faced a 3-month suspension and mandatory retraining. Some questioned if she, too, was a scapegoat, yet her superiors claimed she had a history of unprofessional conduct. The mother from Renee's flight, whose child was crying, also gave interviews confirming the rude treatment she experienced. Her heartfelt testimony added fuel to the fire, ensuring Delta couldn't downplay Renee's story as an isolated incident. In the end, Delta came out with statements about the importance of a renewed commitment to inclusivity, promising to implement the audit's recommendations. The CEO spoke at a press conference, citing Renee Moore's courage as a catalyst for corporate reform. As the months rolled on, Renee felt a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her was satisfied that the issue had been addressed so publicly. Another part recognized the bittersweet truth. The journey toward eradicating prejudice in large institutions is never truly over. Nonetheless, she had made a difference. Her single voice had sparked a nationwide conversation about flight attendants' treatment of marginalized passengers. She continued traveling for her job, though she was more discerning about which airlines she flew. Ironically, after the massive policy changes, some of her best flights ended up being on Delta. She noticed flight attendants were more attentive, carefully listening to passenger concerns. Renee wasn't naive enough to think everything had changed overnight, but she believed some measure of progress was evident. News outlets occasionally ran updates on the civil rights audit, praising Renee for her determination. The online trolls and hateful messages that once flooded her social media dwindled over time, replaced by supportive comments from people who saw her as a champion of fairness. Even the Department of Transportation took note, using Renee's case as a model for urging other airlines to adopt stronger anti-discrimination measures. They considered new regulations that would require airlines to report the number and nature of racial discrimination complaints filed each year. Laurie Henderson continued her work as a flight attendant, now hailed as a hero by some, though she was alienated by colleagues who felt she had betrayed the company. She and Renee remained in contact, bound by a shared commitment to ensuring people were treated with basic respect in the sky. Looking back on her journey, Renee found herself reflecting on what it meant to stand up for oneself against a major corporation. There were times she questioned her decision, the legal threats, the media scrutiny, the personal attacks. Yet every time doubt crept in, Renee remembered the sting of humiliation she'd felt on that flight and the sense of abandonment when the crew refused to help her with even the smallest concerns. If she hadn't fought back, she reasoned, that same pattern of discrimination would have continued unchecked for countless other passengers. In a symbolic gesture of reconciliation, Delta's VP of Customer Experience personally invited Renee to the unveiling of their new Equitable Hospitality Initiative, a program that aimed to train all employees, ground staff, flight attendants, gate agents in cultural sensitivity and equitable treatment. Renee attended out of curiosity more than anything, wanting to see if the airline genuinely embraced change, or if this was just a shiny PR move. She watched as executives, flight attendants and trainers spoke about bridging divides and offering consistent service to every passenger. While Renee remained cautious, she allowed herself a modest glimmer of hope that the industry was slowly changing. Renee's story reverberated far beyond a single airplane cabin. She became a beacon for others who had faced discrimination in 1,000 different ways at restaurants, in schools, in workplaces. Her personal victory signaled that through resilience, documentation, and collaboration with the right organizations, even a single person could spark policy changes at a multinational corporation. The flight crew ignored black woman headlines that once sensationalized her ordeal, now transformed into civil rights audit overhauls airlines' discriminatory practices. In her new role as a public speaker, Renee often recounted the emotional roller coaster, how she had to maintain her composure in the face of blatant disrespect, how she balanced her corporate career with the demands of a civil rights campaign, and how she refused to let cynicism swallow her. Whenever she concluded a talk, she reminded audiences, "Don't let anyone tell you your voice is too small. If you can shine a light on injustice, you can make a corporation tremble. You can move mountains if you stand firmly on the ground of truth." And so, in that spirit, Renee Moore's story soared beyond a single flight and a single day, reminding the world that standing up for one's rights can transform frustration into lasting change, and that sometimes the greatest turbulence isn't in the sky, but in the hearts of those who think some people deserve less respect than others. Discrimination can hide in the simplest interactions, and Renee Moore's story proves how one voice can dismantle an entire system of injustice. Her flight was supposed to be routine, yet it became a wake-up call for a multinational airline, forcing it to confront the flaws within its own walls. With strength and unwavering focus, Renee refused to be silenced, pushing for a civil rights audit that shook the corporate world and sparked a new wave of accountability. Now, we stand at a turning point where real change is possible if we keep demanding respect and equality in every corner of our lives. Let Renee's courage inspire you to take a stand. If you found value in this story, remember to hit the like button, share it far and wide, and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Together, we can shine a light on the injustices that still lurk in our world.